Mike here with Grinding Gear Garage. We're getting ready to do some maintenance items on our blaster, and we figured we'd make a how-to video. We're going to be doing front wheel bearings. As you can see, they're a little shot on the front of this blaster. And we're going to be doing A-arm bushings as well. There's going to be two different videos posted. We'll separate each out, one for the wheel bearings, one for the A-arms. They're pretty much the same teardown and installation on both, so stick with us and we'll get started. So once you have all your tools together, you're going to come over and start disassembling your front suspension. So this is where we're going to use our 14mm and 17mm wrench and socket. Your upper A-arm is a 14mm head for the bolt, and then the nut on the rear. You're going to need to use 14mm on the head of this bolt and the 17 on the nut on the back side of your shock. You can take the top or the bottom off. Obviously the bottom's preferred because it's attached to the lower A-arm. You're going to need to remove an aftermarket front bumper if you have one, or your stock one. We had to move it and swing it out of the way so we could get our front bolts out for the lower. To finish up the upper, you're going to have to take this bolt out for your ball joint. It is a 14mm head with a 14mm nut on the back side. Also, there'll be a cotter pin. Don't forget to remove the cotter pin. The upper ball joint should just slide right out of your hub assembly. It's pinched with this bolt. And to take your lower out, you're going to take your 14 again on the head and the nut of this bolt, and then the head and the nut of this bolt as well. These may give you a little bit of a problem. We had to tap ours out slightly to get them out. Once you have them out, actually before you take these out, you're going to want to take your ball joint out because it's going to fight you a little bit. It's a 17mm for the castle nut after you remove your cotter pin. One little trick we have is you're going to take your floor jack, if you have one, and you're going to apply pressure to the hub itself, not to the A-arm. So you're going to apply pressure, you're going to compress the suspension, and then what you're going to do, you're going to take your castle nut off and you're going to lightly strike with your hammer in a downward direction. And what that'll do is that will pop your ball joint out of the control arm. This is kind of like a press fit from drawing the nut in. It's tapered, so you have to apply some pressure. You don't want to hit the castle nut or the head of the ball joint. You will damage the threads, and these ball joints are not replaceable. You have to get a whole new A-arm. So once you have it disassembled, we're going to move everything over to our workbench and start taking the bushings out. So we have our upper A-arm in our bench vise, and to do this bushing set, it's pretty much the same as the lower. Instead of 2 points, you have just one long spacer, which just slides right out. And then you have two bushings. We have to use a long screwdriver that we have, which is right here. Same principle. You're just going to tap on the edge of it. And she pops right out, and then do the same thing for the other side. Just like that. And we're going to do the same thing to this A-arm and clean all the crud and old grease out of the inside. Stuff that's old in this set of A-arms is quite brown, and as you can see, the grease is starting to break down. It's nasty. So we want to clean as much of that out as we can and clean up the outsides. If you're real meticulous about your quad, you can also powder coat the A-arms while you have them off. Clean everything up. Do your ball joints as well if they're bad. We're just using a wire brush real quick to clean up all the mud and junk built up on our A-arms so it looks a little bit more presentable. So we'll be back with you guys here in a minute. we'll clean this up and get it ready to reinstall the new bushings. So we have our upper A-arm all cleaned up, ready to go. We have our pin as well, all cleaned up. We brake cleaned this and got all the old crappy grease off of it. As you reinstall everything, we're going to just use some red bearing grease. We have a grease gun filled with this as well. I left it at work. So after you do this, you're going to want to pump grease in your Zerk fittings and make sure everything is lubed up as well. We just take a finger, dip our finger in the grease. We keep one tube that we continuously keep cutting down and just use that for these bearings, or these, I should say, bushings. You just want to lube them up real good. And they should just push right in. Clean up any of the excess grease around the edges, and then repeat the process for the other one. A little finger dab of grease, smearing around, and then inserting. Depending on the brand, some might be a little tighter than others. You might have to tap them in, just like we removed the other ones. Just give them a light tap with your hammer, nothing too aggressive. Just clean up any excess. And then you're going to take your inner rod. You're going to grease it. Apply grease to that as well. I know we're greasing our rod. Bad joke. I'm going to flip it around to do the other side. And it should just slide right into our bushings. The key for this stuff is making sure it's all clean, all the old grease is removed. This we're going to have to give a few taps with our hammer. And when tapping in, I always like to leave a finger on the side we're tapping to. Sometimes this rod will catch the bushing and try and push it out the other side of the arm. Now we made a little bit of a mess here. A lot of the grease kind of pushed off of the rod, but it's not that big of a deal. So our bushings are installed. We're going to take our caps. As you can see, they're still dirty. Clean them up. Make sure everything's good. We're going to apply a little bit of grease here around this edge as well. So when they're on there, they don't wear out everything completely. So then once we have that done, we're ready to reinstall the bushings in our lower A-arm. So we have our cleaned lower A-arm in our bench vise. We're going to do the same process pretty much over again. Instead of just 2 bushings, you're going to use 4 because of the 2 mounting points. Same process. I'll lube up each bushing. Install it into the arm. Now you necessarily don't have to lube up these bushings before you install. It's just a habit I kind of have to give everything a nice pre-grease before you pump it with the grease gun, just in case it doesn't get to all the nooks and crannies. Kind of get you a head start on your greasing. Now once they're installed, turn off any excess. Now you always want to remember grease attracts mud, dirt, and grime. So I try and keep my Zerk fittings right here on the A-arm, and the bushings in general kind of clean from any grease on the exterior. It's going to promote buildup of gunk and dirt, and it's easier to clean the quad when it's just dirt instead of grease and that kind of stuff. Now that we have everything cleaned, we're going to install the spacer. So we have both of our clean spacers. We are applying another thin coat of red bearing grease to them. And the same process, you're going to insert one end. And same thing, I like to keep a finger on the back side as I'm tapping it in. The bushing you're tapping towards. Just because sometimes the spacer doesn't always fit into the bushing, and it can sometimes push out. So we have that cleaned off. We're going to do our second one. Same thing. There we go. Now our lower A-arms have the complete bushings in them. You're going to do the same thing you did for the upper. Take your caps, clean them off, apply a thin coat of grease to the inside to prevent any premature wear to your A-arms. And once you get everything cleaned up, we're going to move back over to the quad and reinstall. Once you start to reassemble, please grease and lubricate all the bolts before you put them in. The 2 lower on each side and 1 upper on each side. You're going to put some grease on the actual shank of the bolt before you reinstall it. That's your pivot point, essentially, on that bolt. You want to make sure it's lubricated so it doesn't rust to that sleeve on the inside of your A-arm. Now once you have it all back together, a little trick that we use, kind of the same thing we did for the ball joint when we jacked up on the hub. Now we're just going to apply pressure to the A-arm itself, anywhere really, as long as you're applying pressure as like the quad sitting on the ground essentially. You want to tighten your suspension with some load on it, just like so. You want to simulate having the quad on the ground. If you don't and you tighten it up, you can sometimes put preload into it. As you can see, the right side is up higher because it's acting like it's loaded. You just want to tighten everything up nice and tight with the suspension loaded, and then let it back down. Put your wheels and tires back on, tighten your lug nuts up, and then take it out for a test ride. As you can see, I'll take this weight off. You remember our A-arms before. I am pulling and the whole quad's moving. I can't get them to wiggle at all. Everything's now nice and tight, thankfully, so that should alleviate some of our problems. Now we're going to finish up, put her all back together, and we have to finish up a few more things. We need to jet the carb for the reeds that are in it and a few other things. But other than that, our Project Blaster is almost ready to be sold. If we come across any other maintenance items we need to do, we'll have a video posted. You guys enjoy the rest of your weekend.